Good morning, everyone. Can you please take a seat? Maybe we can, leave the doors open for people to come in, but let's now be seated quietly, those that are not here. So I hope you guys are doing great and have already enjoyed all the wonders of Mérida and the gastronomy and the cultural activities and all the thrill in this city. So we hope you're really enjoying yourselves. I would like to call the panel to come and sit with us today, please. So Lucia Lomond, Sandy Andelman, Rodolfo Dirzo, and Lawrence Porter, can you please join us for this morning's panel? Si me ponen la primera presentación, por favor. Okay. So this morning's panel is about the future beyond paradise. What are the frontiers today in tropical ecology, conservation, and society, their interaction today in the Anthropocene? So to start, I would like to define, because we're talking about beyond paradise, I need to define first what we mean by paradise, and I'll give you my own personal perspective. So paradise, at least for ecologists and tropical ecologists, is of course this amazing diversity that is found within this forest, no? The huge or not so huge trees in the different forests, the huge amount of birds and insects and so on, but also the concept of paradise for tropical biologists was about being there and doing there. So there's a lot of especially friendly ecologists that could be found in the tropics. You probably don't recognize, but it was paradise for me to know these tropical ecologists as we got married. And so ecologists used to work as a bit like Mariello said, work alone and be very happy to spend a lot of time in these forests, taking a lot of data, thinking really hard about the observations. So basically, one major research question that drove all the thrill in the 70s and 80s, and probably still the 90s, was how can so many species can coexist in the tropics? And there were all kinds of research areas, no? Trying to document and understand the processes behind the latitudinal gradient. What were the local and the regional limits to richness, and how did these local and regional and biogeographic processes interact? What were the different niches, no? The potential and realized niche, both through time and through space. The regeneration niche, for example. Of course, the dynamics of these very interesting species and the metapopulation dynamics also. The life history traits and the trade-offs that they encompass. The role of phenotypic plasticity and how could species deal with all these changes in light, in water availability, a huge role played by density dependence in controlling populations, biotic interactions and the role of evolutionary processes in their co-evolution, productivity in tropical forests, and nutrient limitation. And some of the key hypotheses were the Jansen-Connell hypothesis, or for example, the Hubble's neutral theory that really inspired a lot of us to do a lot of research in trying to explore both to test these hypotheses and to explore their consequences. But then we went beyond paradise. So this paradise started not to change, and basically it was the growing awareness of this huge deforestation of the tropics. So millions of hectares being transformed at very fast rates in all these tropical countries, the impacts of this transformation, and I must say that, of course, in a different context that was set yesterday. It's not at the low scale in this very knowledge-rich context as the Mayas, but it was really largely extensive, very both intensive and extensive transformations. And so in 2004, ATBC gathered a team of scientists to explore what happened beyond paradise, right? So how could the challenges of tropical biology in the starting 21st century could be started? And so the main paradigm from understanding the processes associated to the origin, maintenance, and functioning of this huge diversity in what, there's a huge discussion of whether they're pristine or not pristine ecosystems, as we heard yesterday, to really changing the perspective to providing the knowledge needed to sustain humanity as well as nature and these tropical forests. So the key questions changed dramatically to things like understanding, of course, the structure but much more the maintenance of tropical ecosystems under these pressures by anthropogenic endeavor. Evaluating human impacts on tropical ecosystems and studying the social drivers of change and the social responses associated to the conservation of this tropical diversity. Also, the guiding principles were relatively different. So it was, first principle is about develop broader values and concerns. So rather than just focus on the diversity, really see beyond and incorporate the needs of the populations and all these growing demands for the forest. Second principle, to adopt interdisciplinary and participatory approaches. So we heard from Marielos on Sunday very much about this large shift in going to interdisciplinary research, but also to participatory research, meaning to really collaborate with local communities and to interact with different types of stakeholders. And the third principle is about linking science with policy. And it was really having a very different mission for science. And the recommendations that emerged from this paper were to assemble and disseminate biodiversity data using advanced technologies, to create a mega network for tropical researchers and others, and to strengthen research institutions in tropical countries. So, and the fourth, it was to increase these interdisciplinary interactions. So with this in mind, we have set up a panel. And the panel is set up in the following way. We have gone through this first introduction. I will shortly introduce our panelists in a second, and they will each speak from 5 to 8 minutes. And then we'll have a discussion, and then we'll hear from the audience. And so let me please introduce you our panelists. We're extremely pleased to have this amazing group of panelists. So Sandy holds a bachelor degree from the Lewis and Clark College and a PhD in behavioral ecology from the University of Washington. She has served a lot of key positions as the deputy director of NCIS, which is the Synthesis Research Center in California. She's been chief scientist and senior vice president of Conservation International. And she's the president right now and CEO of OTS, the Organization for Tropical Studies, that many of you may have gone through their field stations and their field courses. She studies tropical ecosystems, biodiversity, climate change, and the links between environment and human well-being. She has very much worked in designing, monitoring systems, and systematic conservation planning. Today, she also serves in a series of boards, like the Board of Trustees of the, the GARS Biodiversity Foundation and the World Economic Forum as a transformation leader. So welcome, Sandy. We're very pleased to have you here. Then we have with us Rodolfo Dirzo, who holds a bachelor degree from the Universidad Autónoma de Morelos and a Master's of Science and a PhD in Ecology from the University of Wales. Rodolfo first spent a few years as a professor at UNAM, where he was a researcher, then the head of the Evolutionary and Ecology Department. He was the director of the Los Tuzlas Station, and right now, he's a professor at the Stanford University in the biology department. He's also head of the Latin American studies in Stanford. His work he's done a lot of work in different areas, but he has specialized in ecological and evolutionary relations between plants and animals, but also the impact of human activities on natural ecosystems. And he's been able to assess actually the global magnitude of deforestation and its consequences. He holds, he's a member of a lot of academies, including the Mexican Academy of Science, the US National Academy of Science, the American Academy for the Arts and Sciences, and the California Academy of Sciences. Rodolfo, we're very pleased to have you here. Then we have Lucia Lomond. Lucia holds a bachelor degree from in biology from the University of Sao Paulo, and then a master's and a PhD degree in ecology and evolutionary and systematic biology and tropical biology conservation from the University of Missouri. Today, she's a professor of botany at the University of Sao Paulo. Her work is well known on patterns of plant diversification and biogeography, and she's been keen at assessing the processes shaping the assembly of tropical plant communities and patterns of species distributions. She's been really pushing for the incorporation of scientific knowledge into policy conservation priorities, and she has played a leadership important role in global initiatives such as Diversitas, the research program, currently Future Earth, and also in ATBC. Welcome, Lucia. And then we have Lawrence Porter. He holds a master's in biology from Wageningen, and then a PhD in ecology from Utrecht University. He has held several positions, for example, as Venny Laureate or something Laureate, associate professor, person professor, assistant professor at the Forest Ecology and Management at Wageningen University. He has published a lot of very influential papers on how species differ in their traits, how these traits shape species performance, the distribution and the community assembly, and as well as the species coexistence, and how do these traits scale up to functioning and ecosystem services. He's done this through empirical fieldwork, experiments, and modeling, and he's really very much moving now today in the resilience of tropical forests and their ecosystem services. And we're pleased to welcome you. Welcome, Lawrence. Okay, so now I forgot, we had a fifth panelist, which is Dr. José Sarukhán. and a very, very well-known personality in the tropical biology and in science in Mexico and Latin America, and I would say in the world too, but unfortunately he had a health problem, so unfortunately he's not able to be with us today, but we have been discussing some of these ideas with him. Okay, so the four panelists have been asked to answer this question: what strategic, scientific, social, and policy actions have been taken by the community of tropical biologists during the last decade that have had a significant impact on the conservation and sustainable management of tropical biodiversity and ecosystems. So we'll hear from them in a second, but before that, we want to test again the same hypothesis as yesterday to see whether the discussion in the panel may shift your perspective. So we have two questions for you. On observing an increase over the last decade in interdisciplinary activities from biologists and interaction between science and policy, and another question on, as tropical biologists have a sufficient and significant impact on the ground, on conservation, sustainable use, social integration of tropical ecosystems and natural resources. So I would like to have, please, the instructions for connections. Today, the network seems to, the network connections first. Today, the network seems to be fine, but please remember that this principle of resilience. So if we can choose different modes of connections, that will be helpful. So those people that can use their cell phone, please just text a message. Those of you who have a national 3G or 4G connections, please do so. Those of you who are using the Fiesta Rewards site, you can go ahead and use it, or you can use ATBC 2017. It is free now and it's available for all of you. So just choose one of them, but just try. I mean, I guess it's hard, right? But it's a random sampling, so let's have diversity, and each try to choose a different connection option. Okay, so you should hopefully be set up with some connection option, and now we go to the question. Okay, so the questions are, the first question, please answer, we really need your answer. The first question is, have you observed an increase over the last decade in interdisciplinary research activities by biologists that address interactions between science and society in the tropics? I will give you 20 more seconds. We only have 29 answers, so please, please, please vote. Okay. It's nice to see online so you can compete if you don't agree. Okay, 5 more minutes. Sorry, seconds. Sorry, minutes, no, seconds. Okay. So vote quickly, because we're going to change to the next question, and remember to refresh the system to answer the following question. Okay, following question. Do you think that we as tropical biologists have a significant, sufficient impact on the ground, on the conservation, sustainable use, and social integration of tropical ecosystems and natural resources? Faster now, 40, 90 answers now. A few more seconds.
I don't know. We can see the sample.
The sample size is in the corner. In the left-hand corner, we have 111. Okay, so 2 more seconds, and then we're going to turn off the system. Okay. So, Sandy, you start. So, have a mic. Is it on? It's turned on. Hello? Yeah. Okay, so can we turn this off? And then we're going to go to the panel presentations, and we'll start with a presentation by Sandy Andelman.
Thank you. It's really an honor to be part of this panel. And I wanted everybody to just take a second and think about what you were doing in 2004 when Beyond Paradise was published, because I know that I was thinking about, should I leap out of the ivory tower and go to work for a conservation organization as a scientist? And another thing, in 2004, we were not as connected as we are now. We didn't all have cell phones, and especially in the tropical sites where I was working, we couldn't communicate by email and often even by phone. So if you wanted to collaborate, you literally had to get on an airplane and fly around. And so it was still the case that much of our knowledge of tropical ecology, my field, came from studies of individual scientists and their students at a single site, not such a large scale, whereas now people work at networks. It's more the exception, I think, than the rule that scientists work in only a single site. In one place, and many are working in multiple countries, so we have networks. Also, there has really been a shift, not only, I think, to interdisciplinary collaboration in the tropics, but thinking about the resilience of socio-ecological systems and the notion of planetary boundaries. So people and ecosystems are part of a larger Earth system, and in the tropics that, there are many signals that we are getting beyond the safe operating space for the planet. And I've seen in my own career that these ideas, like resilience and planetary boundaries, have really had a big effect, not only on donors, but also on governments and international policy mechanisms. But I'm curious how many people in the room here have had some engagement with some of these international policy mechanisms, like Aichi targets, part of the Convention on Biodiversity, the Global Environment Facility, a $14 billion funding mechanism for environmental conventions, IPBES, the Sustainable Development Goals. So how many people here, just raise your hand if you have had some input to all of this? Some of them, any of them. So it actually still looks like it's a minority of people in the room. So I wanted to particularly highlight the Sustainable Development Goals, where I've seen the scientific community in the tropics, but also outside the tropics, really have a lot of input into how do we think about these goals? Are they just a collection of goals, or, as you see here in the diagram, are these goals structured in a way, as Pavan Sukhdev and colleagues at the Resilience Institute have said, where we have at the bottom the biosphere, the ecosystems, that society has to function within the boundaries of the biosphere, and equity is a principle that we can't have sustainability if we don't also have equity, and that the economy up at the top has to serve society, but also serve it within the boundaries of the biosphere. And that's a very big change, I think, from the Millennium Development Goals, and I think it's really been the contribution of scientists that's led to that change. But for me, I think it's also important to think not just about what progress have we made since 2004, but what are the big challenges and opportunities for the future. And I think, when I leapt from the ivory tower and went to work for a conservation organization, I found myself, in addition to doing science, but really confronted with having to do many things for which I had absolutely zero preparation and training. So literally things from negotiating intellectual property agreements with governments, with ministers, in order to be able to share data, but also to talking to heads of state and CEOs of very large corporations. And that was something I wish I had had, that kind of training in addition to my research training. But we have known for decades that agriculture is one of the biggest threats to ecosystems and to biodiversity at all scales. And yet I think this community of tropical ecologists has failed to engage with agriculture at the scales we need to impact the trajectory of change. So for example, not so much here in Latin America, perhaps a little, but to a very large extent, there is a second green revolution being catalyzed, particularly in Africa and in Asia. And we're all familiar with the negative environmental consequences of the first green revolution, and many of the benefits of increased yields of the first green revolution. The benefits reached an asymptote, and even in some cases declined, because water was depleted, soil health declined, we lost pollinators. But through multi-government and public-private partnerships, now we have efforts like Grow Africa and Grow Asia, which are being planned at national and continental scales. And there is virtually no consideration of ecosystems or protected areas. Those of us here in this room aren't sitting at the table. We're not synthesizing the results of our research to really inform both the trajectory of agricultural development and where it happens and how it happens. And I think particularly in the tropics, where by 2050 most of the world will be living in the tropics, and 2/3 of the world's children will be in the tropics. Africa is viewed as the breadbasket to feed the planet for the future, because about 80% of the world's arable land that's not currently in large-scale mechanized agriculture is in Africa. but also in Asia. So if we don't take our scientific insights and engage at the scale that this is happening, we are going to lose many of the places we care about, but humanity is going to, lose the system. Sorry. And then the last thing I wanted to say is we also need to get outside of our comfort zone when it comes to communication. So I worked for 12 years for Conservation International, and CI thinks of itself as a very media-savvy organization. But a few years ago, the CEO of CI at the time met a man named Lee Clow. And Lee is 75, gray hair down to here, surfer, but he is the marketing genius behind Apple computers. And Peter told him about CI, what CI does, and he said, wait a minute, these are all of the issues that I care deeply about. I've never heard of you guys. And that's the thing, most of the world has never heard about the insights of our research. So Lee Clow had this brilliant idea to get movie stars, and all of these were volunteers, to do very short 3-minute videos where they're speaking for nature. If nature could say what people are doing to the planet, what would nature say? And so here you see in, just over a year, this is how many people these have reached. So I really encourage everyone in this room to get out of our comfort zones and start communicating with the public, because most of the public doesn't know about what we do.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Sandy. So now we will give the floor to Rodolfo.
Can I have my presentation, please?
Sí. Yes.
So good morning, buenos días, bon dia. I would love to say it's good to see you, but in fact I can't see you. Sorry about that. So let me take the question that Patty and Miguel and John presented to us. I thought it would be interesting or important, at least to me, to divide the question into two parts, as you can see there. One is what actions have we taken over the last decade to address tropical biology, and second, what have the impacts been in terms of conservation and sustainable management. I am going to do my remarks based on those two parts. The first part, I want to talk about actions. And as you have heard from Sandy, slowly but surely we're doing things in different fronts. My first bullet point there indicates that individual researchers, or sometimes teams of researchers, have been conducting research addressing definitely conservation and management. Not only the description of the beautiful biodiversity that we have in the tropics of the planet, in that paradise, but also addressing questions that have to do with the conservation and management of those systems. I have two acronyms there. One is INOGO. That's an initiative in which a group of scientists are looking at how to make oil palm plantations more diversified and more friendly with nature. The CLI is an experiment in which a group of researchers have done experimental manipulations of the megafauna and see what is the dynamics of a savanna ecosystem if you don't have the animals there. So as you can see in the second slide, we have made research, progress in research via experiments, and I think that's really, really critical in our progress in our science. And also, obviously, we have made significant research via the use of advanced technology, remote sensing, molecular tools. We have been able to explore now, to begin to explore the microbial world, which is an incredibly important aspect of biodiversity in the tropics. And we have initiated the use of other technologies, such as phones for citizen science in relation to communication, soundscaping, camera trapping, informatics, and big data sources. So a lot of progress there. I also think this is to me particularly important because we have seen the rise and flourishing actually of entities that have been designed to address conservation and intelligent use of knowledge that we have gathered over the last few years. My two prime examples here are the National Commission for Biodiversity in Mexico. Unfortunately, José is not able to be with us today to talk about it. Another one in Colombia is the Humboldt Institution. Those entities that we have, scientists have developed over the last few years with the participation of scientists, I think have represented a very important action on that front. The next one has to do with the engagement with the development of institutions that support interdisciplinary research. I can mention the case of the Inter-American Institute for Global Change, an institution that provides support to address questions that have to do with adaptation and mitigation in light of global environmental change. And they promote interdisciplinary work and international work. We have seen, as Sandy has mentioned, engagement of scientists in policy through biodiversity-related international programs such as IPCC, the CBD, IPBS, and so on. So I'm delighted to see that gradually we're moving a little bit in that direction. And lastly, I wanted to mention that we have seen direct and indirect participation in guiding policy governments in local critical issues. For example, early warning for fires, for GMOs, early warning about the risk of invasive species and disease, and also we have seen the flourishing of niche modeling in light of global environmental change, climate change in particular, and we increasingly see the participation of scientists in establishing or defining where to establish natural protected areas. From all of these plethoric amount of actions that we have seen taking place over the last few years, I would like to mention three take-home messages that I see derived from these efforts. One is that I see a significant scientific improvement regarding documenting of biodiversity. We know much more about biodiversity today, including particularly microorganisms. We know much more about ecosystem functioning, and we have begun to understand a little bit better the nature of the threats beyond deforestation, which is the usual thing we used to do decades ago. Now we can see beyond deforestation, and also we have moved away from the preoccupation of species extinctions. Now we're looking at more detailed aspects of extinction, such as population extinction, declines of species, and so on. We see good signs of increased multidisciplinary work, including engagement of social scientists to some extent, and we see signs of increased engagement in policy guidance. But not everything is paradise, in my opinion, because I don't see that we have a strategically concerted efforts to integrate the multiple, frequently successful local initiatives to learn collectively from one another. I still see limited rewarding from academic institutions to scientists, to crazy scientists engaged in dissemination and policy guidance, and I think that's a structural issue that we need to improve. And I think an aspect that Sandy mentioned, I think is really very important. We have done some effort, but we still see limited success in translating and disseminating the issues of tropical biology. And also I see a failure to highlight the successful cases where science has been central in addressing and being good in providing policy leading to human well-being. There's a number of wonderful success stories that we have not disseminated and actually highlighted as we should. Let me move on to my second part, which has to do with the most difficult component of the question, in my opinion, which is what significant impacts can we see? I think this is a tricky question because impacts, in my opinion, can be long-term and sometimes can be very cryptic. Take the case of citizen science. We have seen, at least in the case of Mexico, tremendous increase in the number of citizen scientists participating in the research, but we have not seen yet what a change that has made in the conservation of nature. But I'm hopeful, but it's difficult to evaluate, at least at the moment, in my opinion. Let me mention the case of protected areas. I think we have seen an increase in the numbers or area of natural protected areas, but the effective management of those areas still is a critical issue that needs attention. There's a paper that most of you probably have seen by Bill Lawrence saying that about 50% of the protected areas in the tropics are not being effective protected areas, particularly because they don't pay attention to the surrounding neighborhoods of the preserves. But in addition to natural protected areas, I think we need to increase our appreciation of the landscape mosaics of conservation. I mean by that areas of sustainable use intermingled with areas of conservation of biodiversity and ecosystem functions. And the examples that we begin to see, particularly those that are driven by indigenous communities, seem to be very, very important and very productive way of approaching conservation at the landscape, mosaic landscape level. And then I want to finish my reflection on this component by saying that impacts will remain constrained, in my opinion, in the absence of addressing the two-pronged population issue, so to speak. The fertility rates that have to do with women empowerment and the unequal distribution of resources among countries and within countries, sectors of different countries. I think that's a crucial issue that we need to definitely pay attention to. What critical needs or promising avenues do I see? I see a tremendous importance of socializing our current knowledge about the significance of the kinds of things that we do in tropical biology for the world. Why is this paradise critical for the planet? And I think this is really critical, the dissemination and socialization of our understanding that we scientists have accumulated. We need to socialize this with the public. I think this is crucial because an educated, engaged society, a society which is capable of voting for eco-friendly leaders, is particularly critical today. I had the idea of mentioning the importance of partnering with celebrities, but I'm delighted that Sandy actually addressed that point already. Second is that I think that engagement of rural indigenous communities is absolutely central. For example, in Mexico, about 80% of the forested lands of the country are within indigenous territories, within rural territories, so people in those places are the owners of the biodiversity, at least in this country. And we know that about 25% of the forests in the developing world are also managed by local communities. So I would like to say that we have seen tremendous progress in the last few years, but there's much more to be done, but we need to pay attention definitely to the social and human dimensions before we can be happy about how we can maintain our wonderful paradise present in the tropics in the planet today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rodolfo. And now we will give the floor to Lucia.
Thank you very much, Patty. And I want to start by thanking Miguel Martinez Ramos and John Kress and Patty for organizing this panel and giving me the chance to participate and discuss such important issues for our future. So in order to answer the question that was posed to us, which is, so what actions we as tropical biologists as a community have conducted that have impacted conservation and sustainable management of forests, I divided my answer into three main parts. So I'm going to start talking about scientific actions, I'm going to then talk about some social actions, and then some policy actions, and I'll finish with the last slide mentioning some challenges that we have ahead of us. So in terms of scientific actions, I think we've advanced substantially, actually a lot in the last 10 years. We've generated a lot of new research and we improved our knowledge substantially, especially in the three priority areas established by Beyond Paradise, which were ecosystem structuring and functioning, anthropogenic effects to ecosystems, and social and economic drivers of anthropogenic effects. So we've advanced a lot our knowledge in those areas. We've also conducted a lot of new cross-disciplinary research, both multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary, which was not so common 10 years ago. We also conducted a lot of new applied research, and actually some new research fields emerged in the last 10 years, such as, for example, landscape epidemiology, which has direct impacts to human well-being. So we really generated a lot of new research that can be used for policy. We've also had some very significant technological advances, and as Sandy mentioned, 10 years ago, cell phones were not that common. I didn't have a cell phone myself 10 years ago, And this led to much faster research products. So for instance, through meta-barcoding, we accelerated large-scale inventories of neglected biodiversity, such as microbes and fungi, as Rodolfo mentioned. Also through genomic sequencing technology, we also were able to access genetic diversity much faster. Through improved satellite image resolution, we were also able to conduct faster analyses of land change and climate change. And also through the increased computer efficiency, we were also able to improve substantially our modeling capacity. And the last point in terms of scientific actions is associated with biodiversity, informatics, and data sharing. So I think we improved a lot in terms of data sharing, and biodiversity informatics allowed us to do this much more rapidly. So this is a change in the concept of data sharing, so people are much more open and also accelerated by biodiversity informatics. So we have a lot of journals with fast publication rates. I was trained as a plant systematist, and publishing a monograph could take up to 8 years or something in the past, and now we have journals where these kinds of information can be published within 6 months, and this is a major improvement. Also, we have a lot of online searchable platforms, so we have checklists for local regions, and also now, for example, for angiosperms, there's an effort to produce a world checklist for all angiosperms in the planet. We can also search for geographic distribution through GBIF. We can search for phylogenies through the Tree of Life. We can also access types and a lot of specimen information through JSTOR. And this also impacted a lot how we do research. And also, finally, through mobile applications, we are also able to share data really fastly. So for example, through applications such as Map of Life, it's free and you can download, and you can, for example, for us here in Mérida, you can just put your location and ask, okay, so what biodiversity do we have around us? And the application immediately gives you a list of amphibians and birds and plants that are all around where we are. So Map of Life is available for the whole world, and as we add more data, it will become even easier to access this information. And other platforms similar to that are iNaturalist or PlantNet, and that really allow us to get the information rapidly. In terms of social actions, I think we have advanced substantially in 2 main fronts. One of them is institutional and organizational improvements. So we have much stronger universities, institutes, and capacity building and funding in the tropics. And this changed a lot in the last 10 years. So we have a lot of people that were able to be trained in the temperate regions and then got back to the tropics and now have whole research programs and training a lot of the new generation. We also have much stronger international research collaboration networks, and I think Marielos gave us a really excellent lecture on that, and everybody appreciates the importance of that and how this has increased in the last 10 years. We also had a multiplication of synthesis centers, so these are becoming more common. In Brazil, for instance, there are some new initiatives to have those synthesis centers, and I think it's really important we have a lot of scientific information out there and to really synthesize all this information. We also have much stronger bridges between society, academia, and the government. In terms of awareness and engagement, I think we improved in 2 main fronts. One is actually understanding the role of scientists not only in the generation of knowledge, but also in public outreach and environmental education and policy and governance. So 10 years ago, I think there wasn't that kind of awareness of the role of biologists in this respect. And we also have much increased public awareness and society engagement, and this has happened a lot through citizen science, and is really nice to see society and people entering information into these citizen science projects and participating in the research process, and that way they appreciate even more the importance of biodiversity once they participate in the process and enter new data that can be used by scientists. Also, the scientific cafes have been really important, and scientists talking to the public and talking in a more accessible languages. The Pint of Science, which is a movement that started in the UK, and the idea is to take prominent scientists into the pub to talk about their latest research findings to the public, and this became an initiative throughout the world, and we now have on a couple days scientists going to pubs and telling about their research to people in many different countries. In terms of policy action, I think, well, so we established really important international platforms. So 10 years ago, we already had IPCC, and only within the last 5 years, we created the International Governmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which has been really important. And we have also been much more successful into incorporating research into policy conservation and biodiversity management. And this has happened through the increased efforts towards translating knowledge into action. So a lot more white papers are being produced and reports, not on a scientific language, but in a more accessible language. We also see much stronger links between research institutions and the government. And as such, the government bodies are now much more qualified to deal with the environmental challenges. So I think we really have advanced a lot in 10 years. But we still, as scientists and as a community, still have several challenges ahead, and I wanted to highlight two of them. One is the research implementation gap, which is associated with partly with differences in the timing between scientific research, which takes time, and with policy actions that have to be immediate. And also, we still need to improve the connections between scientists, society, and policymakers. Scientists, we will not find all the answers alone, and we really need to jointly define questions, research priorities, and jointly find solutions. And once we have joint goals for the next 10 years, so joint goals between scientists, society, and policymakers, once we all know where we are going together, then we will really be able to balance conservation and development and to exchange short-term economical growth by long-term sustainable development and finally really transition to a green economy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Lucia. Now we will give the floor to Lawrence.
Thanks a lot, Patty. If you don't mind, I will stand up so that I can see the people at the back of the room. Buenos dias. Es un gran honor y placer estar aquí con ustedes. I'm really happy to be here in Mexico. Mexico is not only a biodiversity hotspot, it's also a cultural hotspot. And I think the fact that these two have co-evolved together and still can coexist together means that we can make this happen. And that's the topic of today. Now, Patty and Miguel, thank you very much for inviting me here. And I thought, well, talking about the future of tropical biology and inviting only grey, old and wise people. I thought, well, maybe it would be good to have some younger people. And when I turned up here, it turned out that I was the only grey one and they are the only three wise ones. But so I went out yesterday night and I was integrating with some local biologists, and I asked them, so what do you think about the future of tropical biology? And the first one was an old and well-known biologist, and he says, there is no future. It's all going to disappear. But luckily enough, he had a very wise and young student. He said, you know what? We have to deal with this. We have to deal with the human pressure. We have to deal with novel ecosystem, and we have to design better ecosystems. So it's a pity he's not here today with us in the front of the room, but you can talk later with him. And I would like to walk you through the slides and what I think has been the impact of tropical biology. Now, echoing a little bit what the others have said of me before, I think we really advanced our knowledge tremendously. If you see way back in the 70s when I 80s when I started my fieldwork and I tried to find the Biotropica somewhere copied in a library down in the tropics. And you could read that in an afternoon and you were up to date with everything about gap dynamics that was known in the tropics. And nowadays we have this tremendous rich online information. We have these databases in which you can search biodiversity information, such as in GBIF. You can search for trade information, you can apply it, such as TRI. And I think what is really impressing me as a field biologist, I'm used to stand in front of a tree and a leaf, but the fact that you can scale up. People that use GIS systems and remote sensing. And I've seen yesterday the beautiful map of Hanna Tumisto, who showed, based on Landsat images, remote sensing images, the soil fertility across the Amazon, the fern species composition across the Amazon. This is really something that was not possible 2 decades ago, and I think that's really impressive. So we've been scaling up, and that's important to be relevant for society and for the globe. And with modeling, we are able to model far into the future. And I think that's also very important. That allows us to detect different scenarios and opportunities for development pathways. And lastly, a lot of synthesis has been going on. We had these excellent research networks like SciGeo, CTFS, that gave us an overview of what's happening with the structure and dynamics of forest across the world. And this collaboration that Marius was referring to on Sunday, it's really very important to get the overview and realize that maybe my system is different than your system, and maybe that's related to environmental factors, social factors, or other kinds of things. Good. So then the question is, did policy pick up on sustainability? And I think the answer is really yes. We have these very important global assessments like the Millennium Ecosystem Assessments, the IPCC, what's going on with climate change, the ATBC, what is happening with ecosystem services and people. And I think that's really very important. Also, the buzzwords that we are using are also used by the policymakers. We think it's important to work on landscapes because that's where most of the action is going on. Everybody focuses on sustainability and, interestingly, on resilience. So I had this postdoc of us who works at ICREF, and we had a resilience workshop. And we were there with 20 scientists working on resilience, trying to find out what it really meant, how you can measure it, and how it is. We had these complicated discussions, and he said to us, you know what? Did you see the Sustainable Development Goals? All 17 Sustainable Development Goals include the word resilience. So it's already there. And although maybe you as scientists don't know yet what it means, it's already brought into action. So we really have to hurry up and provide that information. And ecosystem services, local livelihoods, and human well-being are really on top of the agenda. And I think there are lots of instruments, like the Paris meetings, that really have spurred global interest in reforesting, in allowing natural forest development to occur. Initiatives like here in Latin America, 20 million hectares in 2020. Initiatives like the RED, how you can reduce deforestation and forest degradation, and the Convention of Biological Diversity. And this really mobilizes energy, money, political interests, and allows the opportunity to really do something. And then the question is, did we really do something? What is the impact of us as tropical biologists? And I think our impact can potentially be very large, but I'm afraid that in practice it's still very little. And it's a little bit what the others have said before, we really have to team up with other people. Let's try to team up with the practitioners, the local people that are going to use your knowledge, those forest managers that have to harvest wood sustainably, the NGOs that have large connection networks with the local people, and the government agencies. And I'm afraid that we are starting to do this, but maybe at a little bit too late stage, and maybe not so frequently. So what do we need then to have an impact? And I think we need an attitude shift, and I think we should do our science in a different way. And I'm a humble ecologist. I work on leaves. I love leaves. They come in different shapes, flavors. There are 50 different shades of green. I don't know whether you realize it. It's really true. We've seen yesterday that the whole Mayan society lived on leaves. I mean, without the corn leaves, there would not be corn. Without the leaves of the secondary forest, there would not be fruits and forest products. So the Mayas built a career on it, and I'm building also a career on it. Yeah, and you can stay in that comfort zone, and I can stay and continue working on those leaves and finish my career. But halfway you think, well, maybe I can do something else. And maybe next to the theory, we should really value and appreciate the application. So what I think we really should get out of our pristine forests, get out of your island, if you happen to work in BCI, there's a whole world beyond there. And we really should embrace that world. I mean, there are loggers there. They are not all nasty. They are also interested in the sustainable use of their forest because they want to continue that resource for a long time. There are people that work with shifting cultivation. For them, it's important that the shifting cultivation system is maintained, that soil fertility is recovered. So I think it would be good if we move out of these unifocal focus on leaves, tropical forest, and look at the whole landscapes and all the different types of land use. And maybe, I think as ecologists, we are very good in identifying problems. We love our pristine nature, so every time a skidder enters into the forest, every time somebody cuts a leaf from the forest, every time forest is converted, we start to wave the hand and say, hey, but this is not good. We really should protect this. And if you log and if you intervene in the forest, then biodiversity declines, the big mammals disappear, and that's a problem. And I accept that. I think that's very good. And I think we've indicated to what extent these things can be a problem. But it can also be very good to come up with solutions. So if this is the wrong way, how should we do it? How can we log in a sustainable way? How we can produce food in a sustainable way? And I think that solution-oriented research is really a shift that we need in the way we're doing research. And then we're talking about doing multidisciplinary research, and I think really the way forward is to go for interdisciplinary approach. And what we should be doing, and I have not done it myself, and it's what we are doing now together with the stakeholders, and I have two very brave Mexican and Guatemalan PhD students here in the room who work with those stakeholders, and they work in forest agricultural landscapes. And they ask them what services are important for you. And is this soil fertility important? How can you maintain it? And together with them, they are working and they are co-designing their questions and they are looking for results and interpretation of the results that can be used by those users. Outreach, of course, very important. Share your stuff. I would like to invite Sandra Bullock, but unfortunately she is not there to do my clip for the outreach of my leaf trade research. But you can do it, of course, also yourself. So start blogging, start sending the press your press releases. And I think nowadays with YouTube, it's so easy to put something online of your research. We had great students, Katerina Jakovac, who is here in the room. As a PhD student, she went back to Tefé in the middle of the Amazon. She presented her results to the local families with whom she lived, and they now realize what the results are and how they can implement them. And what you should do, and it's echoing a little bit what Mariello said, you should talk to the others, talk to the practitioners, talk to the users. And most importantly, listen. Because we have a little bit our tendency to send our information that nature is important, diversity is important, but we should also listen what's important for the other people. And finally, and I realize this whole list of things is very daunting. If you're a poor PhD student, you think, gee, I would love to measure my leaves and now I have to interact with the stakeholders and do the outreach. It's good to come out of your comfort zone and try to do these things. But in the end, I think it's also very important that you stay close to your heart, who you really are. So if you're a die-hard scientist, please continue to do so. If you love to interact with local people, please do so. And if you're able to move people along to make sure that they conserve large areas, and if you're an actionist, please do so. So my recommendations to myself and all of you is open up your heart, try a little bit larger share of things in order to reach the other people. And that's it. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. So now we have prepared a few questions for the panelists. So each of the questions, two of you, hopefully from very different perspectives, will answer them. We're hoping for quite short answers, so we are able to have also some interaction with the public. So if we could have the presentation, please. No, yeah, thank you. The next one. Ay, perdón, aquí está el, ¿dónde está el? Gracias. Exactly. So, Sandy and Lawrence, from your perspective and from your field, has any progress been made on the core recommendations of the Beyond Paradise report?
I think certainly there has been progress in terms of creating networks of scientists in knowledge. So I would say yes, but I also would ask a question has it been enough given the rate at which the world we live in, and particularly the tropics, is changing? You know, do we need to do more to really advance knowledge and to make it accessible and to build networks to do the kind of work that Rodolfo was talking about, really looking at landscapes and particularly indigenous landscapes, you know, while they're still there?
Thank you. Well, when this whole report was drafted for the first time, it was in Bangalore, and I was a young postdoc then, and I thought, well, these kind of reports, that's for these wise people, these old people, and some of these great people. And I didn't pay, for wise, eh? And I didn't pay much attention. I thought that will come later. I will focus on my cool leaves. And so I didn't read it, to be honest. I only read it last weekend, I must say, to my embarrassment. And I like these novel technology, like the electronic voting, but I prefer the way that Mariellos was voting. So I would like to ask to you, and please stand up, who read the paper of Bama Beyond Paradise? So I count here about 32 people. At least a panel read it, that's great. And of those 32 who read it, so for whom did it change their direction of research? Please stand up. So you read the Bama paper and you thought, I should work on human affected systems, I should work on interdisciplinary research, I should make my work relevant. Who was impacted by this? Very little. So, yeah. So my proposal now for today is that the committee, the organizers, send out a paper to the whole audience, all members of this meeting, because I think it's a really great paper. I was really impressed. It was very visionary. It's posted on the ATBC website. And then the second thing is we asked the young PhD students to make a selfie with their favorite researcher. And I would like to ask you to give a different assignment. So can you also make a selfie with you and your favorite end user of your scientific research? And so connect to those people and think what you would like to do together. Okay, we need to move on. So in terms of what progress have we made, I think in terms of assembling information, it has been great. Another recommendation has to be strengthen the research stations. And I think these research stations, like here, Los Tuxtlas in Mexico, La Selva, they've been instrumental in training generations of scientists. So I think we really should appreciate them and love them. Having said that, I think at the same time it's important to go out of those paradises of those research stations and go to the landscapes where really the action is going on. Where are the people that hunt? Where are the people that use those resources sustainably? And maybe it's good to look at sentinel landscapes, for example, that CIFOR is working on, and work together with different groups of scientists from a social point of view and ecological point of view.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to the next question. So, Rodolfo and Lorenz, are tropical biology scientists and social scientists more interactive now than 20 years ago? Rodolfo.
Sorry. That's okay. We can play with this telephone, with this microphone. So I think, Patty, the answer in general is yes, in very general terms. And I think we have some lines of evidence that actually show that, at least locally, in a number of isolated cases, that is the case. Let me mention a number of programs that actually try and foster and promote that. For example, the NSF Dimensions of Biodiversity and FAPESP program. Locally, for example, there is in California a consortium of universities that interact with Mexican universities. That is the to me, very important and famous UC Mexus program, a program that Arturo Gómez Pompa, a prominent figure in tropical biology, started, connecting the UC system, the system of University of California, with Mexican institutions to do research, and also, very critically to me, to promote exchange of students across the two countries, despite the fact that there's going to be a little wall in between, according to some policymakers of the planet. So there has been a lot of that, and now UC Mexus with Ezequiel Escura has been doing great in that respect. So there's a number of indications that suggest that that is the case. There's institutions such as the Inter-American Institute for Global Change, which actually promotes research in which researchers from different countries, North and South, and different disciplines, propose the questions, ask the questions, and engage in the research. There are some new programs of training. For example, in Stanford, there's the new program, interdisciplinary program in environmental issues. And so I think there is a lot that provides evidence that there has been cooperation. However, I think there is much more to be done. I did a little bit of research because I think this question actually needs some research to be answered. And I went over our journal, Biotropica, and I looked at the number or percentage of papers in the last 10 years that have looked at some issue in which a social scientist is participant in the research. So let me give you the numbers. In 2014, the percentage of papers with social scientists was 1.9. In 2017, the number of papers in a typical annual accumulation of papers in the journal Biotropica is only 3.2. So we can see a slight increase, but definitely we need to do much more in that regard. We need to find strategic ways of improving that situation. There is some progress, but there's much more to be done.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, wrong way.
Thank you. So back home, I teach the study, I work for the study Forest and Nature Conservation, and what we tell the students in the first year is really very important. All problems between nature and society have a societal component and an ecological component. So if we really solve this, we should understand both. And then we point the students to the social sciences group. Go to the left if you want to do boring social stuff, or go to the right, where we have these very cool ecological groups that work on elephants and ecosystem stuff and butterflies and all interesting things. And in fact, we leave it up to the students to integrate those two components. And what we really need, and why we didn't do it so far, is that basically we ourselves have had our training only in a monodisciplinary science. I'm a biologist. The first time I was exposed to social sciences when I was working with Sandra Diaz on a paper on social actor strategies. And I said, social what? And I was sweating with this paper and I tried to understand, and it really takes a lot of effort. So we need to train a new generation of students working on those interdisciplinary research. And that means that we need a shared language, a shared conceptual framework, a shared understanding. And it creates a lot of time to create. And we're now setting up these kind of courses, and my hands are sweating. It starts in September. And I think what here in Mexico, what Patti is doing at the ES, it's really very wonderful. And I think we're only starting, and we should teach at all our universities interdisciplinary research.
Okay, thank you. So let's go to the next question. So, Sandy and Lucia are institutions from tropical and temperate countries forming more and more significant partnerships. Sandy.
I think yes, and Rodolfo showed some of that, and Lawrence mentioned some of the networks like Rain4, the Team Network, which I've been involved in, but the Organization for Tropical Studies, in the last 2 months, we just did a survey of stakeholders, both in South Africa, where we work, and in Latin America. And there's a very strong perception that it is still not an equal partnership. And I myself feel this and have observed this. And I think maybe what's more exciting than temperate tropical partnerships to me is more South-South partnerships. And I see that really just beginning now, and I think it's very exciting.
Yeah, I agree. Well, so the partnerships are stronger, but so in the past, I think they were much more, so partnerships between temperate and tropical were much more exporting biodiversity, and that's what it was all about. I think it became much more equal in the last 10 years, and in part, well, greatly due to the increased funding, increased intellectual capacity, and training in tropical regions. We still have some ways to go. And these partnerships, they're really much more scientific, and we still need to develop more partnerships in terms of policy, and as the implementation of these is still kind of weak, although we have international initiatives like IPBS and things like that. And this is really a critical problem because conservation is really a global issue. So we really need to strengthen, and I agree that the South-South partnerships are really critical, and it's unbelievable how we really have a lot of North-South, but very little South-South partnerships.
Great, thank you. So now for Lawrence and Rodolfo. How land use change and global climate change has increased the urgency or alter our priorities for integrating scientific research, sustainable use, and social integration into tropical ecosystems research?
Thank you, Patricia. I think that's a really, really critical question. And I would like to preface my comments to that question by saying that I really, really think that it is important for us scientists to spread the word about the connections between the drivers of global change. I really believe that a critical agenda, scientific agenda, and one that is directly relevant for society, is that we understand how the different drivers of global change interact. In the past, we have been used to addressing each one of them separately: climate change on the one hand, land use change on the other hand, invasive species on the other hand, and pollution on the other hand, and so forth. I think it's really, really essential that we try and see how those factors interact and create the difficult situation that the planet is at the moment. A very simple example, take the case of overexploitation of animal life. Given forest fragmentation and deforestation, now the access to remote areas, areas that used to be remote in the past and difficult to get access to for hunting and poaching and things like that, is facilitated by deforestation and fragmentation. If you add to that climatic change and the possibility that species are going to be moving or tracking climatic changes, that is going to become a much more difficult situation. So I think we really need to pay attention to this critical agenda of how drivers interact. And the answer is definitely land use change and climate change are synergizing themselves and creating a very difficult situation. But there's not only the two of them, they're interacting with other drivers of change. Let me very quickly mention that land use change is obviously a critical issue for biodiversity because, as Sandy said, agriculture is the most important driver of obliteration of biodiversity in many parts of the world. And that means that we really need to pay attention to how agriculture and food production is done in light of global change. And I would like to come back to my point of indigenous communities, because it is in the lands of these indigenous communities that we see that we have all of this biodiversity residing still, and this is where we need to pay attention to for food production and things like that. And that said, I want to mention that many indigenous communities, because of the traditional way of using the resources, the traditional ecological knowledge, they have created many varieties, cultivars. They also have the wild relatives of many different species. And really, in light of climate change, global change, and so on and so forth, many of the critical solutions going forward in terms of food production and combining land use change with conservation of biodiversity and conservation of agro-biodiversity is in the hands of these incredible people, and we really need to be working with them to the extent possible.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Sorry.
I think.
So you were first, I forgot.
Okay. I think these two issues really have to change the way we think about the relevance of our research. And I think what I really like is that most papers provide a justification of their research. Why is this for the society so important? I think what we are lacking a little bit is in our recommendation, making a hands-on recommendation. So given our results, what can you really do with those results to change practices on the ground? And I think we advance a lot on climate change research, what tropical forests do and the feedback loops with the climate. I think land use change issues have mostly focused on the negative impacts, like hunting. And what I would like to see is, in fact, so how much land use change can you have? How much biodiversity loss will there be? Are we happy with 90% biodiversity remaining and being 90% sustainable? Are we happy with 80%, 50%? And what exactly are the trade-offs? And I think it's also very good, and what we do quite little, is embrace the whole land use intensity gradient. So we tend to describe what's happening with forest biodiversity, with mammals, with insects, but we tend to forget to describe the agrobiodiversity. What's in those agricultural fields? What species do we find over there? And what's the complete bundle of ecosystem services that we are talking about? Is it only about biodiversity, or is it also about sustainable production? Is it also about well-being? And I think it would be nice if we could advance a little bit more on that and take a more complete and holistic picture.
Okay, so now Lucia and Sandy, how best can the tropical biology community team up to take specific actions into influencing the direction of scientific research and policy action on the major environmental and social issues of today?
So I think we need to think about the applications of our research and have some kind of commitment with applied research while still conducting curiosity-driven research, which is also critical and complementary, and follow your heart, like Lauren said. We also need to have a clear understanding of which kinds of research questions are most relevant for policy. And we need to keep in mind that for research to have a significant impact, it cannot be just unidirectional and we producing research and giving the results to policymakers, but we need to kind of break this hierarchy and together develop some of these questions and together find solutions so we can actually act as peers in the construction of knowledge. And we also need to develop ways to amplify the impact of the research that we are conducting and also amplify the impact of all the research products that are already out there. And we really need to design more research programs and training opportunities that really bridge the gap between academia and decision making. So we really need to train students that are equally comfortable, so doing science, outreach, and policy making, and students that are able to conduct more action-oriented research in addition to the curiosity-driven research. So I really think that the lack of science is not what is preventing action.
So there are a couple of things that I'm really, really worried about. One is that, you know, many of the funders who support long-term research, field research in the tropics and networks in the tropics are funding this less and less. And I know from, you know, having been at Conservation International for 12 years, but also, you know, with close ties to the Nature Conservancy, World Wildlife Fund, more and more, I mean, my estimate would be probably half the people that these big international conservation organizations are hiring, and these organizations, well, TNC works mostly in the US, but also in the tropics, and you know, the others working in the tropics, they are hiring people who have never been in the field, who have not experienced a tropical forest, who haven't been in an indigenous landscape, and this really worries me. And similarly, there is an intrigue of international conservation NGOs with, you know, analytics, data analytics, big data. Part of it is driven by wanting to get funding from the Googles and Silicon Valley. But for example, one major conservation NGO just stopped funding some of its long-term monitoring and data collection projects because they said, we have so much data already. We don't need to collect any more data in the tropics. All we need is artificial intelligence. And like, these are the things I am really worried about. And this is the community, this community of tropical biologists who really needs to engage with governments, with conservation organizations to communicate the value of what we do and the importance of the insights from our work for humanity.
Okay, so we unfortunately are running out of time and will not be able to take questions from the audience, but I would like to go ahead with our experiment of voting. So Ivan is going to put on the screen the voting, the 2 questions, and we'll see whether your answers changed. And meanwhile, please go ahead and vote. And I would like to wrap up just with a couple of conclusions. So we did hear, yes, there's been a strong change in the way we do things after Beyond Paradise. And by the way, it is very important that all of us get to read this paper, which was really influential, that has a lot of information, but we're not doing enough. We're not doing enough, and we need to go outside our comfort zone, and we need to be aware of very different new tools and new skills that students need, and we need then to train a new generation with different needs. How about we are at 55, let's wait a little bit for this one. We also heard that there's still a lag, and so part of this lag and part of these imbalances have to do with important differences between North and South, and also to really listen more to the different stakeholders and direct ourselves to the funders that will fund this research. Can we go to the second question, please? So we're going to test. We'll not be able to send this time to show you the results of before and after, but we'll let you know on our website what happened with the survey. And I would just like to thank our great panelists and all of you for being here, and thank you so much for this great discussion.